Before we get started in the preparation process, let's first talk about the screens we're going to be preparing. Now, the first thing we'll talk about in the screen is the frame the screen is made out of. A screen consists of a frame, wood or aluminum, or a roller frame. Right here we have aluminum and wood. Now, the way the screen works is this mesh is stretched across the frame and then glued to the frame, or with a roller frame, it's then tightened to the frame. In this video, we're pretty much going to be using static frames, which has the screen mesh glued to the frame, because they're much easier to use as you're getting going, and they're a lot cheaper as well. So what's the difference between an aluminum frame and a wood frame? Well, through the course of the set showing you the darkroom, you saw that we had a washout sink, we had a dip tank, and that involves a lot of water. So when you're preparing the screens, you're putting them through a lot of water, and then when you're cleaning them up in your press, you're exposing them to wet chemicals. What happens with wood when it gets exposed to water and then absorbs water or chemical? Of course, it warps. Now, during the screen printing process, you want a flat screen. So if you have a warped screen, it's going to be very hard to work with. That's why it's always optimal to use aluminum screens, especially if you're going to be using the screen for a lot of different jobs. The screens come in a lot of different mesh sizes. These right here are 110. This one right here is 230. They range all the way down, starting at 24 mesh, going up to 305. Now, what does the number mean? The mesh number means how many mesh threads cross per inch. So you can see in the illustration, if you have 110 mesh threads crossing per inch, that would be a 110 mesh screen. Vice versa, if you had a 24 mesh screen, it would only be 24 threads crossing per inch. So the lower you get, the bigger the holes in the mesh go. The higher you get, the finer the mesh holes go. It's a lot like DPI. The lower DPI, the more grainy your image looks. The higher the resolution, or DPI, the more resolute your image works. Same type of thing with screen mesh. So a 110 mesh is going to be your basic screen printing mesh, 110, 156, and we'll be using a lot of those in the video. But how do you know if you should use a 230 mesh, or if you should use a 110 mesh, or an 86 mesh? There are three main contributing factors to choosing the mesh. First is the type of image, the second is the hand or feel, and the third is the type of ink you'll be using. Let's talk about the type of image for a while. When you're using different types of images, the one thing to keep in mind is the higher the resolution and the higher the detail in the image, whether it be a small font, a fine line, or a gradient halftone like we saw in the previous artwork section, the higher the mesh needs to be in order to hold the detail in the image. Let me explain by this illustration. As you can see in the illustration, we're looking at a 110 mesh screen and a 280 mesh screen. The 280 mesh screen has a lot more threads crossing per inch than the 110 mesh. Now, if we're using a big block design, let's say one of the Ryonet logos that just has a block name of Ryonet printed across it, you can see as the R fits over the 110 mesh, there's plenty of mesh cross sections to hold on to the detail in that R. Now, as we move over to the 280 mesh, you can see that there's plenty of mesh sections to hold on to the detail of that R. However, if we take one of our gradient halftone dots, a very, very small portion of that dot, let's say 5% of the dot, which is the smallest the dot gets, and then we try to put that small part of the dot on a 110 mesh, there's nothing to hold on to it. It just simply falls through that hole between the mesh cross sections. We put that same dot onto a 280 mesh, and there's mesh cross sections to then hold onto that image and retain the detail. So the more detail you get, the higher the mesh needs to go to hold that detail. A good formulation to use in determining mesh size versus detail is the one that we showed during the rip section. If you have a halftone line, you basically take your halftone line count and times that by 4 or 5 to get what mesh count you need. So if you have a 30 line halftone line, you'd probably want to put it on a 156 mesh. Now, if you notice the mesh sizes, they vary in number and they jump every 30 or 41. So you have an 86 mesh, then you have a 110 mesh, then you have a 156 mesh, 200 mesh, 230 mesh. You don't have a 110 mesh and then a 116 mesh. When you're talking about a small difference like that, there's not enough difference in size of the actual mesh thread count in order for it to really affect the image. So you kind of go every 20 or 30 runs in order for it to affect the size of the image. The next thing you want to look at in choosing your mesh is how you want the ink to print on the shirt. How do you want it to feel? And this is called the hand or the feel of the shirt. The thickness of the mesh dictates on how much ink is left through, because if you have more open holes, obviously you're going to let more ink through. If you have finer holes like one of those 280 or 305 meshes, it's going to let a very small amount of ink through. The smaller the amount of ink it lets through, the softer the hand or the feel of the shirt. So if you want to get a soft hand or feel of the shirt, you do want to go through a higher mesh. Now, to accomplish this, sometimes you can't accomplish this if you want the opacity of the ink. For instance, white ink on a black shirt. A lot of times that white ink has to be layered on fairly thick in order for it to show up through a black shirt. So if you're printing it through a 305 mesh, that's not going to happen unless you print it 20 times. So it's very counterproductive to print through a high mesh screen if you have to gain opacity on the shirt. Because even if you're using that high mesh for detail on a white ink with using a black shirt, that detail is going to be smudged out after you print it so many times to see that bright white ink. So that is one thing that you want to keep in mind, that you really can't trick the opacity system. If you want an opaque image, use a lower mesh and you'll have to print it a lot less times. The last thing to consider when choosing a mesh is the type of ink you're going to be using. And this really has to do with the consistency of the ink. If you're using a thick ink, you'll want a more open mesh to allow the ink to pass through it. A great example of this is glitter ink. If we try to print a glitter ink that has big glitter particles in it through a 110 mesh screen, the 110 mesh won't allow the glitter particles to print through. So we'd want to use a more open mesh. So if you're printing glitter, you'd probably use a 36 mesh or a 24 mesh, have pretty big holes in it to allow that glitter to go through. Vice versa, if you're using a thin ink, let's say a water-based ink or a solvent ink or a processed ink that doesn't have a lot of pigment in it, that loads it with opacity. So a thin ink, if you print it through too open of a mesh, that mesh has to basically enable the ink to hold up on top of it. If the holes are too big, the ink's too thin, the ink will just flood right through the mesh. Here's a great example of that. Here's a 110 mesh. Now, we'll use a real thin consistency, like water. Now, water drops right through a 110 mesh, and that would be the same thing that would happen if you printed a really thin ink through a 110 mesh. It would basically drop right onto your shirt, flood through your shirt onto your palette, and instead of having a fine, crisp image, you would have a very smudged out and blurry image, and you'd have ink all over the place. Now we take that same water and we pass it through a 230 mesh, which is over twice, and that mesh holds up the water. So if you're printing with a thin ink, you probably want to stay above the 200s. Maybe go down to 156. But stay above the 200s if you're using a thinner ink. If the ink feels too easy to pass through the shirt, which we'll show later some different examples of that, you want to up the mesh in order to get the result that you want. The last thing we'll talk about with mesh, and then we'll move on to preparing the screens, is the color of the mesh. Now if you see this mesh right here, these two meshes are different colors. This is a white mesh, this is a yellow mesh. What's the difference? The white mesh in the exposure process actually acts like little fiber optic cables. It takes the light around the edge of the screen, because you're never going to coat the whole screen with emulsion. There's always going to be a little bit mesh poking through the side. It takes the light that catches and shoots it through the entire image area. That's called light transfusion. If that happens, what can happen if you're using a lot of fine detail in the image area is it actually exposes the image by shooting that small amount of light through it. Now why can we get away with a 110 mesh versus a dyed mesh like a 230 mesh? What the dye in the mesh does is it actually blocks that light from traveling through the mesh fibers and into the center of the image. So the higher mesh is going to be dyed, the lower mesh is going to be open and white Now the reason the 110 mesh is white and the 230 mesh is dyed is because, as we learned earlier, you can't put a whole lot of detail on the 110 mesh. So a lot of times, to save money, because dyed mesh is more expensive, we use white mesh on all our lower mesh screens. Like 156 and below are all white mesh, 156 and above are all yellow mesh. The last thing you want to be careful about with your frames is you have to realize this screen mesh is stretched off fairly tight against the frame. So you do want to be careful when handling the frames. If you're using sharp objects such as like a knife to put the ink in, or if you're not careful when you're lifting the screen up and moving it around, the screen mesh could pop. Now I'll give you an example of this. See right there? We accidentally dropped it and the screen mesh pops right here. This screen's pretty much done. If it pops around the edge, doesn't necessarily mean it's done. What we can do is we can use a little bit of fingernail polish and that'll stop the ripping, and then we can tape it on both sides. So this screen, it's a pretty big rip, but we could possibly use it if the image area was up here and just really fingernail polish that and tape it on both sides, and it might last, because you really don't lose a lot of tension up here, but you start losing it down here, and then the rip will start to migrate and become bigger across the frame. So that's one thing you do need to be careful about, is making sure you handle your frames carefully during the preparation and printing process. Well, we pretty much explained all about frames and screens in a quick overview. Now let's start preparing them.